I've always enjoyed my Sunday visits with the grandpa. He wasn't able to take care of himself anymore, so the family had to move him to a retirement community. Being an independent person, Grandpa had made a big fuss over moving at first. However, once he started to get to know the other residents and learned all about the activities that went on at home, he felt a little bit better about being there. After Grandpa moved in, I would invite him every Sunday to join in on the weekly game challenge. The game challenge depended on the week. Sometimes it was Gin Rummy, other times it was Shuffleboard. Sometimes it was Bingo. The games were chosen by the head of time of the residents from a list, and it had all the available games written on it. When the game was decided upon, the entire hall would be converted into an arena for the game of choice. This week the residents had chosen to play Bakugan, admittedly not one of my favorites. After we played a few rounds of the weekly games, Grandpa and I would get some lunch from the retirement home dining hall and head back to his room so he could tell me more of his favorite stories. Grandpa told me all sorts of stories about gnomes, fairies, giants, and other supernatural creatures. He even told me about the urban legends like the alligators living under the sewer, and he had heard while growing up in New Jersey. It had always been a great fun hearing Grandpa's stories, and always looked forward to hearing a new one every week. The years passed and I entered high school. I didn't stop to visit Grandpa as often anymore because I became busy with hanging out with my friends, doing homework, and starting to date girls for the first time. Even though I didn't have the amount of free time as when I was younger, I would still try to visit my grandpa often, and as I could and join him on Sunday games. I would have lunch with Grandpa, listen to all of his tall tales as we went back to his room. I was older, but still loved listening to his stories. It seemed like he would never run out of subjects to talk about. Even when he told me about his experience as a pilot in World War II, it was always a great fun listening to the trouble he got in as a pilot, flying under the billboards and see how low he can make his personal plane that he bought over after the war go. Finally, it came time for me to go off to college. I would not be back for a while, so I wanted to spend a lot of time with Grandpa before I left. I noticed that his health had been taking a turn for the worst, but he never brought it up. I never brought it up either, because I didn't like to think about the fact that Grandpa's health was fading. I visited him like usual, up until the last day I had free before the start of the new semester. This would turn out to be a visit that I would never forget. We had our usual schedule, play a game, chat over lunch about all the new things before both our lives, and then go back to his room for a cup of coffee, butterscotch cookies, and one of his tall tales. We sat at the table next to one another, drinking over our cookies into the hot coffee, and eating them one by one. Today, Grandpa just seemed more introverted than usual. He hadn't really seen much over dinner lunch either. I figured this was because he thought of having one of his bad days, or one of the days when his bones ached and had a hard time getting around. However, I didn't think this anymore when I saw Grandpa promptly stop eating the cookies in front of him and gave me the almost serious look I had ever given him in his entire life. I put down my cookies as well and listened to whatever it was Grandpa was about to tell me. He cleared his throat and in a great tone said, "You are older now, Thomas. You are about to go off to university and experience a whole new chapter of your life. That is why today I give you some advice." I smiled as I urged him to go on. Grandpa nodded and continued where he left off. "You are the first person I am telling this story to. I told myself that I would only tell my most devoted grandchild in the world of history in hopes that they would not make the same mistakes I did in life. And you must promise me that you will only tell this story to your most devoted grandchild so that every generation has a fair warning." Grandpa paused to make sure I was going to keep the promise. I swore that I would keep on my life, and then he continued on. "You know about your grandmother, don't you? You were only 5 or so when she passed." At this point, he paused. When he saw my expression change a bit, after patting my shoulder for a moment, He went on. Yeah, I miss her too. I always loved her dearly. It is at my old age that I have a lot of time to reflect on my past actions. I wish when we were married I could have treated her better. If I had treated her better, maybe she wouldn't have turned out like that. I was taken aback by his statement. What do you mean? Grandpa sighed. This is exactly why I want to talk to you about. Some advice I want to offer you as you head off into the world and make a life for yourself. You see, your grandmother and I got married in the 50s. In those times, men were the kings of the house, and their wives had to attend to their every need. I'm not saying it's right. It is just the way things were back then. I was in the same as most men in that era. I was fresh out of my military service from World War II and just settled down with your grandmother. We bought a cheap house under a government program to encourage home ownerships, and I got a job working at an office. Unfortunately, like most men of the era, I was always very hard on your grandmother, who, like most women of that era, stayed at home. I had always demanded the best for her. The best housework, the best meals, the best hosting whenever we had the neighbors over. I insisted that she always dressed up, wear makeup, and put on her fine jewelry when managing the house. No wife of mine was going to be a slob and get me mocked by my neighbors. Looking back now, I realize how silly I was to demand all of that to her. But I suppose we were both victims of that culture that time. I think my strictness got to your grandmother because there was occasions when I would see her weeping herself as she makes dinner in the kitchen. When she was like that, I left her alone. I had tried to suggest that she watches one of her shows on the Woman's Network or listen to the cooking show on the radio, but my suggestions were always made her more upset. So I learned to give her some space when she was one of her best moods. However, one night when she was so upset that she burned our meal, so after burning it, she still served it in both of our dishes at the table, sat down and ate her own portion, still weeping as she shoveled the burnt pieces in her mouth. This was unacceptable to me. I castigated her for what she has done and told her to go back into the kitchen and make her a new dinner for us. I told her that if she couldn't get herself together, to simply make me a sandwich. That ought to calm her down a bit, as that was something that changed her. Her tears suddenly stopped with a small smile crept over her face. She laughed a bit and I laughed along too. The whole situation was a bit commercial. I apologized for being so strict and she shook the whole thing off. She brought the dishes back to the kitchen and I set forth on making a second meal, which served as the second time she was waking up to the usual quality of her cooking. After that incident, your grandmother didn't cry again. She went about happily doing the housework and preparing meals. When she was castigated, she would just smile and said she'd do better. She was the model housewife. It was around that time that one of my good friends, Jerry, went missing. Your grandmother knew his wife, Edith, and both together they got a lot of housewives involved in trying to find him. They put up fires like that, but unfortunately, Jerry was not seen again. It was just a few months later after when another one of my friends, Stan, went missing. The housewives got close together again and tried to find him, with little success. After that, the excitement died down. Even though the men were not found, no one else went missing from that neighborhood. It became somewhat of a local mystery. None of the men had a reason to go missing. They both worked at the same office that I did, and they both had a stable home lives. Even to this day in the neighborhood is still talking about the circumstances surrounding the disappearances. The incident did bring the community closer. The housewives ended up forming their own club, which became a national sorority. It had been open for many years during that time, donated to lots of its time, helping the less fortunate people in the community. I was one of those people who always wondered what happens to Jerry and Stan. They were good friends, and I was sad to lose them. It was when your grandmother's health was failing many years later, and we were going to talk about my old-time friends. Here my grandfather paused, as if the subject was hard to talk about, but when he saw my concerned expression, he continued on. Don't worry about me, lad. I'll be okay. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. Many years later, after your grandmother and I were talking about Jerry and Stan, that's when she brought up all the greatest things she cooked while they were looking for them. The mouth-watering roast she had prepared led me to fall to all the members of the search party. The roast beef sandwiches that she had packed for the lunches I took to the office, the blood pudding thing she had made for the neighbors. She went on like this, naming off of the different meats that she had cured and served it to the people over the years. I recalled all of her meals with warmth, but it was a bit confusing as to why she brought it up when I was still talking about my old friends, and that was when the smile came over her face. That same smile that had came over her face at the dinner table those many years ago. An unsettling kind of grin that seemed to reach in and tug at my every soul. "They've already been cooked, dear," she said in a crackling, uneven tone. I felt myself wrench a bit as the thought of consuming the terrible thing that I had. Your grandmother just chuckled and continued on. "I cooked them along with the other people complained about your job. Remember how you've complained about Stan and Jerry getting promoted before you? I took care of that, did I? I made sure the supervisors who were bullying you moved away. Of course, they didn't really go anywhere other than my cooking pot. I had always made sure to cook a perfect meal out of the naysayers just for you." Grandpa stopped in his tale to retch a bit as I stared at him with my mouth open. I could feel the color draining from my face. At this point, I was visibly shaking. When he got a hold of himself, he continued on. "Shortly after, your grandmother told me that she passed away peacefully in her sleep. That same creepy smile was planted on her lips when I found her. After her funeral came and went, her last words haunted me. I wanted to know more. I started reading more of her old journals, and I had learned that the women's club that she had formed with the Jersey White Hat Club had a very dark practice that they put into place. Should any man give them a hard time, it was not above them to punish them in any way possible. They outlined the many ways they would punish their significant others, boyfriends, or troublemakers men in their lives. There were recipes for poisons, instructions on how physiologically torture people. There were so many dark things that I read in those journals that I didn't even want to repeat them. But one of their most twisted games was taking a friend from the troublesome men in their lives, serving it to him in the form of food. They had all sorts of recipes about cooking and preparing human beings. Those journals were just some of the most horrible things I've ever had read in my life. I would have burned them all if I hadn't turned them into the police station for evidence. That's what I did instead. The police read the journals over in complete disbelief. I gave them the journals with the specific conditions of keeping my family out of the media and investigations. I told him it was the only way that I would have handed over the evidence. Since I knew the head of the local police station, he pulled some strings and had me focused on such much of the investigation on the living members of the sorority, like your grandmother's best friend Edith. They investigated local Jersey Hat White Club and had all of the current members for questioning. Our family sat in the sidelines watching the whole thing in disbelief. As you know, Edith had been one of our family close friends for years. Everyone was shocked that she actually was a member of such a dark cult. If they knew everything that I do about your grandmother, they would have been more horrified. Fortunately, that was not the truth that any of them had to bear. Later, the police found out that every chapter of the sorority across the United States was still practicing dark rituals written in your grandmother's journals. They were able to successfully shut down the sorority 2 years ago, after being active for all those years. But I heard recently a new club started up under a different name. This is the advice I want to give you. If you meet a girl wearing a white opal stone-shaped moon on her left ring finger, under no circumstances have a relationship with her. Report her to whatever club she is affiliated to the police. That is their calling card secret, just to be safe. Your grandpa paused to take a drink of orange juice, whose glass sat beside his coffee to calm his nerves, and then continued on. Never, I repeat, never mock a girl by asking her to make you a sandwich. Don't demand anything from her. Treat her equal. Let her do as she pleases. If I had learned just to be kinder to your grandmother all those years ago, I would have not created the monster she became. Be kind to the ladies in your life, grandson. The consequences for doing otherwise are dire." And with this, Grandpa fell quiet. His hands were wrapped around the glass of orange juice for support, but they were visibly shaking. I was shaking too. All this was too much to take in. I could only sit there staring at my grandfather in silence. Every time words came to my mouth, they quickly left me. Two of us didn't talk for the rest of our visit. I simply got up from the table and walked to my car without saying another word when it comes time for me to leave. The words of my grandfather's story echoed throughout my mind for the long drive home. 4 years after my visit, and shortly after, I received my bachelor's degree. My father passed away. I attended the funeral in late spring. The whole family was there. My mother, my father, his two brothers, my cousins, my sister and her husband, of course. The more obscure family members were like to my grandfather's sisters. The cousins 3 or 4 times removed, and the assorted relatives, your standard flair for the typical family gatherings. It was an open casket funeral, so the family could come up and look at him lying peacefully in his own home. I came up and paid my respects. I silently promised my grandfather that I wouldn't tell what I knew happened to anyone in our family, and thanked him for all the good times we had shared. That was then one of my female cousins came up and paid her respects to Grandpa too. She had tried to lighten the move by teasing me a bit about finding a girlfriend. I told her I was in no hurry to find one, and she rolled her eyes. As she went to talk to the other family members, I got in the sight of something white on her finger. My heart started beating loudly in my chest at the sight of it. It was an opal stone cut in the shape of a moon. She wore it on her left ring finger. My eyes shot around to the rest of my room. My aunt wore the ring. My female cousin wore the ring. My grandfather's sisters wore it as well. Even my mother wore it. My head started spinning as I realized all of the female members of the family wore the same ring. I felt my heart pounding louder and louder in my chest. My grandfather had made a mistake not getting our family involved in the investigation. This thought washed over me as I saw more family members enter the funeral house wearing that infamous ring, and all the felt more like they were closing in on me.